You're watching the Metaphysical Mentor podcast with Michael Philpott. Okay, and we are recording. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. This is the Metaphysical Mentor podcast with your host, me, Michael Philpott, and this is going to be a really interesting story. But I always say that with all my shows because I just think this is a fascinating topic. Joanne, before we get going, I just have to do my little business end of the podcast here. So I just want to say a really big shout out to everybody who's been listening to my show for the past year or so, a couple of years anyways, and especially this past year. I want to say thank you to all the love and support that you guys have sent me. And I really, really do appreciate it. So this one is for you guys. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, because I've been off for a while, you know that the algorithm just shuts everything down. So I'm being hidden. So please like and subscribe. And also, if you're on Spotify, hit the follow there. And if you're on Apple, definitely give it a 5-star. And also do me a favor and give me a little bit of comment there. Positive one. Thank you. And if you want to support this channel is funded fully by you guys. So I really appreciate any donations you can send my way. And they're always in the episode link. So there's lots of ways to be able to donate. So I really appreciate that. Whew, hold on for a second, Joanne. I think I talked myself out there. So that being said, Joanne, how are you, my friend?
Yes, I'm well. I'm well. Thank you.
Yeah, this is we're going to be talking about a gentleman named TJ Davis. So for a lot of people who don't know who he is, I call this as like it's a fascinating story about reincarnation, the soul's journey. It's a bit of it's kind of a sad fairy tale in some ways, from what I understand. Karma, it's a really a deep mix, and it's so fascinating to understand that this gentleman's soul and his past lives are so tremendous that he decided to reincarnate to come back into this world again. But that being said, Joanne, so if you want to just kind of give us briefly who TJ Davis was for a lot of listeners who really don't know this gentleman.
TJ Davis was the nephew of Gladys Davis, who was Edgar Cayce's secretary.
Okay.
Edgar Cayce, for those of you who don't know who he is or who he was one of the most renowned psychics of the 20th century. He did 14,000 readings. 2,000 of those were life readings in which he told people about their past lives. But the majority of them were all health readings. And boy, could we use him today, I tell you. Although he left us all this extraordinary work so that we can still look up a lot of the readings that he gave. Anyway, TJ Davis was born in June 21st, 1936. Gladys's brother, Boyd, was TJ's father. His mother was Berlin. And they were alcoholics and they were gamblers. And they really did not want a baby. And TJ's little soul knew this because TJ's intent was to come and be a part of Mr. Cayce's life again, because they had been together for many, many, many lifetimes. They'd been together in Egypt. They had been together all over for centuries. And so TJ, being a part of Cayce's soul family, you know, he was zeroing in on, I want to be with Mr. Cayce again. And actually, this is a theme throughout his life, Michael, because he wasn't the kind of guy that focused on the fact that Mr. Cayce said he had been Thomas Jefferson. He really was focused on, I'm so lucky that I had Edgar Cayce in my life. Well, as it turns out, you know, the way TJ told the story, he wanted to be Edgar's son, but it was too late by the time he checked in on him. He wasn't going to come through Gladys because she wasn't married. So he decided to come through Boyd in Berlin. And that's what he did. But because his mother was an alcoholic, the doctor after he was born, the doctor gave him 2 days to live.
Wow.
he said his body was all dried up like a piece of wood. And so Mr. Casey knew this. So Mr. Casey tells Gladys, bring the baby here. I'll take care of him. And so that's what she did. She brought him over to Mr. Casey. So at 2 days of age, Mr. Casey gave a reading and actually Mr. Casey named him also. He didn't have a name at that point. And when
really?
Yeah. When the doctor came and said, had the blank birth certificate, he said, we've got to give this baby a name. Well, actually, he wanted to give him a name because he thought he was going to die. The doctor did. And Mr. Casey said, call him Thomas Jefferson Davis. That's where the TJ comes from.
That's hilarious.
So Gladys brings the baby over. Mr. Casey does the reading, tells Gladys, give him carnation milk, he'll be fine. She gives him the carnation milk, he was fine. That was the first of many, 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 many health readings that Mr. Casey gave for TJ. It actually saved his life a few times.
So just hold on for a second there, Joanne. Joanne, hold on for a second. All right. So you were talking about how TJ got to Mr. Casey was a health reading at 2 years old.
2 days.
And 2 days.
Yeah, 2 days.
Oh my gosh. So he had his first reading, so which was a health reading that he had at 2 days old. Okay. Thank you. All right. So there. Go from there.
Yeah. And then Mr. Casey gave him 4 of his past lives.
So hold on. I've got to build this up a bit here.
All right.
I want everybody to understand this gentleman's past lives. Now, we talked about this on a previous episode. You can always check that out. Go back to my catalog. But the idea of having past lives and how certain lives are amazing and certain lives are not so amazing. But this is the really intriguing thing. So, which kind of, when I first heard about his story, I think you mentioned it, but I think what sparked it too was I had a conversation with Sydney Kilpatrick, about this. And I was like, really? So let me just preface this. Just listen to this. This is how crazy I'm talking about reincarnation. Okay. So from there, he goes to Casey. He has the reading.
Right. And then Casey tells him about these 4 past lives.
All right.
One of which was his name was Sulanan, I believe, and that was an Atlantean lifetime. He was with the wrong side of the group. He was with the
Sons of Belial.
Belial, right, and Sons of Belial, and he met the soul that became Gladys, and fell in love with her. She, of course, was with the Law of One, the Daughters of One. And she converted him. And so he was one of the men that helped to take people out of Atlantis at the time of the destruction. And he helped to settle different areas around the world.
Interesting.
And that's all outlined in the book and in his reading. He was also Alexander the Great. That's his second that's his first famous past life. But if you were to ever ask him about that, he said, I don't think Alexander was so great. All he did was go around killing people. So he wasn't really happy about that lifetime at all. Then he had a life in early France. He was involved with helping to establish the government of France. And then, of course, the Thomas Jefferson life. What happened in that reading?
So just want to interrupt you because I have a lot of people who listen over in Europe that may be not familiar with who Thomas Jefferson was. I think most people understand who Alexander the Great is.
Yes.
But I know my American listeners should know this from their history lessons.
You better know this.
you better know this. And even my Canadians listen to this. They may kind of understand who this person, Thomas Jefferson, was. So just kind of give a brief history. So TJ Davis, his past life was, one of them was Thomas Jefferson,
who was one of the founding fathers of the United States. He was the 3rd president. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the author of the Statute for Religious Freedom in Virginia, and he was the founder of the University of Virginia, all in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I live. So I'm kind of a stone's throw from Monticello. And so, so he had quite an auspicious pedigree, you might say.
So that must have been really as a parent, I mean, as I read your book, it must have been really difficult, given the, I guess, the mental faculties of his parents, to find out that your son had two of probably one of the most famous lives that most people like. If somebody was a historian, they would lose their mind just thinking about this person as a soul that came in as this young boy into these parents. Do you think that added? I mean, obviously they had their issues. Like they weren't really great parents. Do you think that that added to the stress of Berlin, besides her drinking and other stuff that she was doing too as well?
No, I don't think so. I think it because if you look at the readings and the letters that went back and forth during those formative years, she was pretty much doing her own thing, and her husband was doing his own thing, and they just entrusted that baby to Gladys. And TJ spent the first 8 years of his life living with the Caseys on and off, not constantly. But the thing about the reading that I really want to emphasize with everyone, it wasn't so much the fact that Casey said he was Thomas Jefferson. It was the fact that he said that that soul could do for the world what Jefferson did for this country. Okay,
Wow.
that's the heavy part.
Okay, so let's just repeat that again, because I think that's so important for people to understand on a soul level, but just on a larger scale of that. I think that's really, if you just repeat that, what you just said, because I just wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah, he said that this soul that was in TJ's body could do for the entire world what Jefferson did for the United States. Now,
Wow.
that isn't heavy. I don't know what is. So this was given to him when he was 2 days old. And consequently, everybody at the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which is the organization that Mr. Casey founded, they knew this. Everybody knew that reading. And everybody was watching this little boy to see if there were any signs of Jefferson coming out. And every once in a while there was. I mean, they acted like this was perfectly normal, because in Casey household, it was normal. I mean, TJ used to say, yeah, they had some of the apostles were there. All these famous past lives where people were coming in to see Mr. Casey. So this kind of a conversation was normal to them. And TJ actually didn't know the world wasn't like that until he started to get away from the Casey compound and go to school and have some friends and everything. And then he realized not everybody was having the kind of life that he was having. They weren't seeing fairies. They weren't, I mean, I have a whole slew of things in there that were part of TJ's childhood that were just totally, at the opposite end of the spectrum of what you call a normal childhood. Mr. Casey was his teacher. Mr. Casey took him out to the pier by the lake behind the house, and he taught him about auras. He taught him about reincarnation. He taught him about creation story. I mean, everything you can think of. He's pouring all that wisdom into the body of that little child. There's pictures of the two of them together on the pier, which are so endearing. Mr. Casey truly loved TJ, truly loved him. And it's obvious when you see the pictures of them together. And I think he had great hopes for him. But alas, that did not come to be. And the fact that it didn't come to be caused a lot of grief for TJ. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was because I felt that he had been maligned. I felt that there were people who didn't understand him. People were very condescending toward him. Not that he didn't deserve some of that, but but the idea that, oh yeah, you were told you were going to be this great person, you could do this great thing for the world, and you haven't done anything. Why didn't he? That was what, because I did not know Mr. Casey to ever be wrong on any of his readings. So I was wondering, okay, it's not that Casey was wrong about what he could do. Something happened to put TJ on a different trajectory and caused him to not go in the direction that Mr. Casey foresaw that he could go in. So that was the whole purpose of my book, was to research his childhood, and I read all the letters that were in the archives, to find out, can I piece this together? Can I figure this out? So
Do you
that was.
think Casey's death was because he was supposed to have a reading, what, at 13 or 12 or one of those ages, that he was supposed to have that another reading to help him further, but Casey ended up passing just before that. And was it 45 that he passed?
He was supposed to get a second reading when he was 13.
Okay.
So he never got that second reading.
So do you
Yeah.
feel that maybe his passing just caused a hole in his heart or something like that, that maybe that could have been the start of him moving down the other path, since he was such a big influence on TJ? I mean, I can only imagine having Edgar Casey as your mentor and father figure, I guess, because Boyd wasn't there. He was off doing his thing and not having a stable environment. Do you think maybe that may have caused that have kind of started the path?
Absolutely. But the thing is, I have a chapter in my book about what Casey wanted for TJ's education. He had wanted him to go to the high mowing school in New Hampshire, and he had the woman who founded the school. Her name was Beulah Emmett, and as it turned out, Casey had done a reading on her and found out that she had been an assistant or a teacher's aide to like Aristotle, who was also Alexander's teacher.
Wow.
So there was that connection there. So Casey very much wanted TJ entrusted to Mrs. Emmett because he knew that he would be in good hands, and he was all set to go. Mrs. Emmett accepted him at a much younger age than she normally accepted students. Gladys had them all packed. They had their train tickets. They're ready to go. And at the very last minute, his mother says, "No, I don't want him to go." Pulls him away, and that was, I think, and TJ used to say this all the time. That's when his life went like this. The trajectory changed completely.
That whole timeline changed.
Yeah, and when Casey died, there was nobody at the ARE that took TJ under their wing to continue his metaphysical, esoteric education. So Mr. Casey was gone, and I like, we're not blaming them. It's they had did everything they could do to just keep the ARE afloat once Casey died. But he was thrown from pillar to post at that point. His mother would take him for a little while, then she'd throw him back to Gladys, and then they sent him to Ohio to live with the grandmother. Then he went and lived with an aunt and uncle. He was constantly a little kid on the bus going back and forth, back and forth. There was no consistency at all in his upbringing.
I have to admit something too. When I was reading your book, I was, not like, I had very similar journeys as a childhood, and I had an alcoholic stepfather, so I understand the idea of having a disruptive household. But even as a child, it's kind of a difficult childhood, and I could actually feel the anxiety and the fear from the book. And honestly, I had to skip the pages because every time you talked about Berlin, and it's like, man, I can't read this. I had to flip the page because it just came through. So, I mean, obviously I'm an empath, so I'm going to pick that stuff up anyways. But just that story about bouncing around as a childhood, I remember that as a young man, as a young kid, like moving from house to house to house. I'm at one babysitter, I'm at another person's house, I'm at this person's house, I'm at my aunt's house, I'm at my grandparents' house, and just having all that stress around. And it just kind of like that parallel story. And it was interesting in reading that. I was like, Jesus, it really begs the question, the whole idea between nature versus nurture,
Yeah, he had no fondness for his parents at all. I mean, he didn't really, he looked at them as just two souls that brought him into this world, and that was the end of it. He knew he belonged to Mr. Casey, and that's how he lived. So those first 8 years were just the most enchanting life a little boy could possibly have. So imagine going from that, to the stark reality of nobody wants you, everything that Mr. Casey said you could do. Now nobody was there to help you achieve that. He's only 8 years old. And that was the point I was trying to make. Don't blame him for not going down that path that Mr. Casey wanted, because he was only 8. He couldn't make those decisions for himself. Sure, when he was 18, or as an adult, he could have thought, no, Mr. Casey wanted me to do this. Well, how am I going to do this now? What am I supposed to do? I really think, honestly, Michael, that the reading, people are interpreting that reading wrong, for the world. I really honestly believe it had to do with the readings, that he knew those readings backward and forward, because he used to sit in on them sometimes, or he would read them while Mr. Casey was busy doing a reading. He'd be somewhere in the library reading the previous readings that he had done. So he knew the readings, and he was very attentive to them. He knew what they were all about. The language didn't bother him. The language, for your listener, the language of the readings can be a little convoluted at times. It's sometimes difficult to understand.
Yes.
But he didn't have that problem at all. And, he loved Mr. Casey. He knew that he had been told he'd been Thomas Jefferson. I don't think when he was 3 he knew what that meant, but he would say that sometimes to people, like he'd go up to Mr. Casey and insist that, I wrote the Declaration of Independence or something. And I have some stories in the book about how the Jefferson life seeped through, the bleed through from that life into TJ's life now.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you about. Is, one of the questions also too, let me just, as far as the bleed through goes, is how often did that happen with TJ? Because I know sometimes as people start doing certain things, I know even in the readings, that if you go to a certain location that you may be from, maybe in a past life, or you don't know that you had a past life, but you had an interest there. Let's say, for example, it was Italy, right? You wanted to go to Italy, and just for some reason you're fascinated about Italian culture, but you go through, and then all of a sudden you have these bleed throughs. Did that happen a lot with TJ?
Yeah, it happened quite a bit. It happened when he was right after he got out of the Marine Corps. He decided he was going to do some traveling, and he ended up, I should say, he and a bunch of his friends at Virginia Beach, they were all little entrepreneurs, and they would sell things on the beach to the tourists, and then they collect all the money, and then they would go someplace. Well, one time they decided, we're going to throw locations in a hat. We'll each pick one. Well, TJ picked Luxembourg, and so he flew to Luxembourg. He gets to the airport and he goes, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't want to be here. I can't even understand this language. And somebody came up, a young man came up to him, tapped on his shoulder. He says, you can't read that sign, can you? He said, no. He said, well, he was a student at NYU, I guess. And he said, I'll come home with me. He said, stay with me for a while until you get your bearings. And so they were going to Greece, because that's where this young man was from. So he gets to Greece and finds out that this young man's father was the mayor of Thessaloniki, and he was living in the house that Aristotle used to live in.
Come on, that's crazy.
Yeah, and TJ said that everybody in Greece treated him like he was the king, like he was, royalty. And so there was a lot of bleed through that came through when he was there. Then he decided he was going to travel, so he goes and travels. He goes and travels to Perugia in Italy, and there's a whole story there about when he enrolled in the university there, and he needed a place to stay. But I can't tell you that story because I have to tell you about Stefanella. That's one of his imaginary friends that is involved with that story. So your listeners will have to look at that, read the book to get that story.
Oh, definitely.
But his Aunt Gladys told him that he kept traveling, all through Europe, and he went to Egypt. He went all over. And when he told Gladys, where he had been, it turns out he had followed the exact trail, I guess, that Alexander took when he was on his little Conquering the World tour.
No way.
Yeah. So there was a lot of stuff going on there as far as bleed through was concerned. The other thing was when he was in school, I tell this one story that he was in He
Was
was
that the one about what the teacher asked him to do an assignment?
it was his final exam in history, I guess.
Yeah.
And she wrote they had to write an essay, and he didn't know the answer. He didn't know what he did. I don't know if it was he had to write an essay or whether she was asking specific questions, but whatever it was, he didn't have a clue. So he says, I'm going to write whatever it is that I know to write. So he writes out the entire Declaration of Independence and the Statute for Religious Freedom and the Declaration of Independence, and he signs the names of 8 of the signers. He says, I just signed the names of the ones who were my friends. And he hands it in to her, and she said, this, I'm sick and tired of you. You're fooling around here. You're not taking this seriously. She said, but he was sitting right in front of her, so she knew he could not have cheated. He couldn't have copied this. How does he write the Declaration word for word? I don't know anybody that could do that, right? So they suspended him for a few days till they looked into it. Then they realized there was nothing they could accuse him of, so they passed him. But that was just one of many such stories about, his, he followed a lot of Jefferson's interests. He went into law school for a while because he thought he'd be a lawyer like Jefferson. He played the fiddle, which Jefferson did. He looked like Jefferson. And like I said, everybody at the ARE that would visit Mr. Casey was just absolutely amazed by this little boy, and we're sure that that's who he was. Now, P.S., because I am a past life researcher and therapist, there are many souls who believe they were Thomas Jefferson. There are maybe 6 that I know of, and some of them are right here in Charlottesville. But nobody has the story that TJ has, from the time that he was 2 days old, and then all of the little things that happened throughout his life with Casey and then beyond, that would indicate that he's the real deal. And having met him and having been privileged to be his friend, and having had many a late night conversation with him on the phone, there's nobody I would venture to say that comes close to him. I just I felt it in my heart the moment I saw him. But like I said, this was not a focus of his life. His focus was on Mr. Casey. But still, he became like, he didn't tell anybody when he was older who he had been. He kept all that a secret until I started prying it out of him. And I said, you should talk to people. And you know what? When he did talk to people, he mesmerized them. They hung on his every word. He was just such a fascinating, charismatic man. It was like people are just, he had a lot of groupies. A lot of women were just crazy about him. And I just think if we had had more time, there was a lot more that we talked about doing, that we could have done together. He had his own demons and his own issues in this life, so he was karmically paying for some things, obviously. So it's not that he people get the misguided impression that when you're doing when you have past lives, that each one gets successfully better and better and better, and that's not the case. In Casey's readings, he would say, well, that soul gained in that life, or that soul lost in that life. This one, he was repeating some of the Jefferson pattern of having a problem with money management. The ironic thing is, Mr. Casey told him before he died, he said, when you're of age, go to Charlottesville. I want you to buy some property in Charlottesville, and that's where you should live. So he did. He came to Charlottesville. I think he came around 93, maybe.
Really?
And he bought property. He had 40 acres on a mountain that, guess what? When he went to the top of the mountain with his binoculars, he could see Monticello right across the mountain, the next mountain over. And it used to drive him crazy to see the people. He goes, "That's my house. Why are they in my house?" And and he was living basically in abject poverty, really.
Wow.
I mean, from where he was, who he had been, but that was his karmic path, and he never complained about anything. Never. He was a very he accepted whatever life gave him with a certain amount of grace.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Joanne, is I know because, obviously we had our conversation a couple of years ago when we talked about, your past life regression and past life regression therapy. Were you a past life regression therapist prior to meeting TJ, or was that the inspiration to start doing past life regression?
Um, I'd started it before I met him, but I had started my path, my metaphysical career in 1987, right after Shirley MacLaine's Out on a Limb was aired as a miniseries on ABC for 2 nights. That was my big wake-up call. And after that, I just became, I read a lot about reincarnation as a teenager, but I didn't think of it as a career. And so then in 1987, then that's the year that I joined the ARE, and a friend of mine who knew I loved history said to me, you might be interested in reading about this case that Casey had. His number is 1208. In the Casey readings, people were given numbers to preserve their anonymity. So 1208 was TJ's number. So if those of you who are ARE members, you can actually go on the website and go into the readings and just type 1208, and all of his readings will come up. You can read them. So I did, and that's how I found out about him. And I thought, okay, as a historian and as a writer, and as a past life therapist, I was really curious about what is it like for a little boy to grow up thinking he had been this great man. Was it a burden or was it a blessing? So I was just curious about it. I thought, this is a great story. And Michael, I identify myself as a reporter for the universe. So to me, this was like the great scoop, right?
Of course.
So I spent years and years and years trying to track him down. And I just got one wall in front of me after the other. Finally, I got a call from the people at ARE, and they told me that if I wanted to come to Virginia Beach, they would point him out to me, but under no circumstances was I to connect with him. And I thought, why? They made it sound so sinister. And so I thought,
Was it
well,
just a way to protect them, or?
not him, protect me, they said. So they said he's like a child of a rock star. That's the kind of life he was leading, And so anyway, I didn't do what they said, and then I moved here to Charlottesville in 1995, pursuing some past life research, and I met a fellow past life therapist who was working at the University of Virginia Medical Center. And he said, he mentioned me then to a nurse there at the center. And then she called me and invited me and my children to go to their home for dinner to welcome me to Charlottesville. Well, she said her name was Cindy Thomas. But then she gave me a few hints. She's, well, my husband is a stay-at-home dad, which I knew he was. I knew a little bit about his life here in Charlottesville. So I called my friend back and I said, well, thanks for the introduction. I said, well, she said her last name was, when she called me, she said, my husband, TJ Davis, and I would like to invite you. So then I knew.
Wow.
I thought, the universe is orchestrating this big time. And so I did. I went up with my children to his home for dinner, and it was very bizarre. The energy was very familiar, and yet a little bit stressed or strained a little bit. And so we became friends, but our friendship was on and off. Like we'd be friends for a few years, then he would disappear on me for a few years. And then he'd swoop back in. He called me and he said that he said, I think I know you. I didn't make a great impression, I guess, the first time we met, but it had been about 8 years. And he came to Unity Church where we had our meeting. And it was then that I approached him about, how about if I do, could I do your biography? And he agreed. And so, you know, we went from there. It took 8 years to get it finished.
Oh, wow.
So I was interviewing him, and then driving back and forth to Virginia Beach to go to the archives to read his file, and any file, his mother's file, his father's, Gladys's, anybody that had any interaction with him. I was reading all the letters that were going, because Gladys made copies of everything. I mean, everything is there. His report cards are there. The pictures that he drew are there. It's just absolutely amazing. You have to have permission, obviously, to go into the archives to do this, and he gave me permission to do that. So then it took a few different drafts of the book until we got it right. And I was so, so pleased to be able to do this, because I actually made a promise to him before in the pre-life planning session that I would do this for him. So I feel like I did it. I'm grateful that I did it. I'm grateful that it came out while he was still with us.
Yeah, because he just passed away just recently, didn't he?
Passed away in May. Yeah, May 7th. Yeah. So I miss him very, very much.
And it's interesting. I'll tell you about synchronicities about this, because this whole thing started just before May. I was having a lot of bleed through issues myself. I'm having a lot of stuff coming up. And over the last little while, things have changed in my own development. And I've had so many different bleed throughs. And some of the stuff I knew already, because I had a reading from a friend of mine who was a very well documented psychic himself in this area. And I had a reading from him. So he's describing past lives. So I was getting a lot of these bleed throughs. And one was especially on Egypt. So I kept thinking, I was like, God, I was so fascinated about reincarnation, past lives. I just started tweaking us like that. And I was just going over some of my videos of it, and you showed up. And I just remember something about TJ. And it's like, she wrote a book about this guy. I said, I got to try to get a copy of this, right? So thankfully it's on Amazon, right? So I was like, thank God for the big store. So I was like, okay, perfect. And exactly, I got the book. You put a post up, and that's when you put a post on Facebook and saying, TJ passed away. And I said, this is just like, and I said, oh, I got to do a show about this. One, because it's just such a fascinating story about TJ. And I don't think a lot of the public really knows about this gentleman and his amazing life and just the story itself. I mean, sure, we can just focus on Alexander, Thomas Jefferson, but it's so much more than that. Like, I mean, to think about how souls will reconnect with other souls in this big journey, and their willingness to kind of choose bad parents just to be with those other people that they just incarnated so many times with. Now, have you done any research with yourself with the connection with TJ as far as past lives? Have you kind of did a regression of yourself? Is there another connection that you two have that you're aware of?
We do, but I don't talk about it.
Come on, you give us the.
No, you're not gonna get it out of me. No. We've been together many, many, many lifetimes, and starting in Atlantis. And we had several lifetimes together. So there was that recognition when we were together.
I think that's something that's key, that a lot of people don't know why they know this person, but you just know them. It's just like, I've had that a few times, and it's like, I don't know why I know you, but I just know you. And I've had other people say that to me. I don't know where I know you from. And it's funny because I always laugh, because I was on television for almost 18 years, right? It wasn't like I was a big channel star, but I was always on the television, right? So I always laugh, oh, I just see me from TV. They go, no, I know you from somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's like, then you try to go through, it's like, oh, do you know this person? Do you know this person? Then, but it's so much deeper on a deeper level, on a soul level, that you know somebody.
Yeah.
Did you ever do a regression on TJ? Did he ever let you do one?
He wouldn't let me. He would not let me. No. And the other thing he would do with me was he would not go up to Monticello with me. That was my thing.
Okay, so just for people listening who don't know the history of Thomas Jefferson, what is Monticello?
Monticello is Thomas Jefferson's home
Okay,
here in Charlottesville. Yeah, it's a
yeah,
national historic landmark, and people come from all over to visit. It's absolutely gorgeous, just gorgeous, and all of his inventions are in there. And uh, yeah, it's a magical place, really.
that must
Yeah,
be so bizarre from him. Like, like you say, he's up on his little mountain peak and he can look down through his binoculars. He can look down and just see his beautiful home. And then all these strangers are, fuddling through his home. And he's just like, and I can only imagine in his mind. And I was just like going, these, these cretins, get out of my place,
yeah.
please. Stop
The
touching my stuff.
Yeah, you're collecting all that money and I'm living in poverty over here, you know? I mean, he had a really good friend who was almost like a guardian. She was a friend of Gladys's, and after Gladys died, she sort of took TJ under her wing. She called him her little brother. And I think at one point she sent a letter to the governor of Virginia and told him who TJ had been, that he had been Jefferson, and that they should not charge him any taxes on his house. And they should, you know, yeah, I was like, no, you don't do that. You don't, he was appalled. And I thought, I don't know, because, it's hard enough when you're doing this kind of work to gain credibility.
Yeah.
So, I try to keep everything I do on a very high professional basis. All my books are based on research projects. It's not me pontificating to you about the reality of reincarnation. So when people do things like that, it just takes the rug right out from under us, because, then we look like a bunch of kooks.
Hmm.
And then the fact that there's like 6 Thomas Jeffersons, I cannot tell you how many Martha Jeffersons there are. There are, in my own practice, I've had people come to me. I had a woman come to me and tell me she was Thomas Paine in a previous life. And I said, what makes you think you were Thomas Paine? And she said, because he was a good talker, and so am I. And that was the extent of it.
But you know what? That is so true. I've heard people say things like that. I mean, I'm not a past life regressionist, but I've had people say that. That's because they have one quality or trait that's similar to that.
Yeah,
And they're always been fascinated by that individual. And yeah, I mean, it's got to be difficult because I mean, like everybody like assumes they had a past life, because I think when remember Shirley MacLaine, everybody's talking about this. Oh, I was Cleopatra, I was this, and it was that running joke that back in the '80s that everybody had the past life, right? They're always joking about it. I remember that as a kid. It's like everybody just kind of joked, "Oh, I was this person." Yeah, but you know what? There is an extreme difference between some of the people who actually was, and then the people who think they are. And I think sometimes it gets lost in it. But it's important to understand that it's really about your soul's journey. It's not just really the one life, but it's the cumulative lives. And I think one of the things is missing is, are you gaining in this life or are you losing in this life? I think a lot of people don't understand that part too as well.
yeah. When I talked to TJ, he would tell me that, I knew he was working on this issue of money, because he never had any money. And Jefferson had that problem too with his spending. The biggest thing that TJ was the most regretful about with Jefferson was the issue of slavery. Definitely the issue of slavery. So in this life, I'd say he tremendously gained in that regard. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's the people who are really worse, because all these famous people have, had souls, and they've come back and chosen whatever body they chose to come in and whatever family they chose to come in, because the family that they come in is the right socioeconomic background to help their soul learn whatever lesson it decided it's going to work on in this lifetime. So yeah, TJ's whole, which he would have been excellent at sharing with people, but But he never, like I said, he didn't talk too much about the Jefferson life. The funny part was every once in a while he'd slip. And because I asked him one time, I said, so do you think you were Thomas Jefferson because you remember being Thomas Jefferson? Or is it because Mr. Casey told you you were Mr. Jefferson? He goes, no, it's because Casey told me. So he, at one point, he's saying he had no memory of being Jefferson, and yet how could he explain away the fact that he wrote out the Declaration of Independence when he was a kid in school? And then every once in a while, he'd say something to me, especially in our own personal relationship. You know, if I'd get upset with him, I would kind of shut down and not talk to him for a while because he was so endearing but so unreliable. You know, to get him to sit down with me to work on this book was like, eh. But so I would just I'd have to go in my cooling period for a while, and then we reconnected and he goes, oh, you used to always do that before. And I was like, what do you mean? You know, goes, oh, from the last lifetime, don't you remember? And I'm like, well, I thought you didn't remember. You know, so little stuff like that would just kind of come up, and he could tell you if he knew somebody from a prior lifetime, because you know everybody wanted to meet him because everybody thought that they knew him from the Jefferson life. You know, he could identify whether or not that was true or not. And the thing about people with true famous past lives that I've learned over the 35 years I've been doing this work is that they're extremely humble, extremely humble. They don't brag about who they were in a prior lifetime because they understand that they're here for a different reason. That was then, this is now. You know, you brought some pieces of that with you, maybe karmically, that you're dealing with now, but you can't rest on your laurels lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. Alexander the Great, TJ found that on an appalling lifetime. He wouldn't ever brag about that. He used to say, I won't even, because if I'm going down my driveway and I see little animals or, I'll stop and pick them up and move them out of the way because I don't kill anything. And Alexander was, off on this death spree. So, so there's a lot more to it than the ego allows you to believe. Okay, and a lot of this, and I don't judge. When I have clients who come to me, I make no judgment. There's a reason they're saying this. The people that think that they were Napoleon, I'll say to them, are you seeing Napoleon on the horse? Or are you on the horse looking out of your eyes at the crowd? Because sometimes people when you have a famous past life, a lot of people know you, right? You're visible, you're in the public eye. And I think sometimes people that were in that past life with them, who saw them, then associate themselves with that identity. And then they make that assumption that that's who they were.
That's a
So,
very interesting perspective on that.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I don't usually work with people who come to me and say that they believe that they were somebody famous and will I take them to that lifetime, because when I work with people, I ask their soul to take them to the lifetime that's most impacting them now. I don't say take them to Atlantis or take them to, to medieval England or whatever, because it needs to come from within. It needs to come directly from your soul. That's why I don't really rely on readers either. I don't do readings. I don't tell people who they were, because I believe they need to do that journey on their own. And I've been really privileged to work with people all over the world. And when you do, it's so interesting. We're all working on the same issues. We're all wondering, why are we here? I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. What's my mission? And then that connection they're looking for, that sense of loneliness that people express.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Where did that come from? Why do I feel this way? I don't understand. There's just, to me, past life work is the most profound healing modality that I've ever experienced. And usually in one session, people get their answers. So, so part of his life for the time that I was, he was a privilege and an honor. And I feel really humble about having played a role in telling his story. And in the story, explaining that the reason he didn't do everything that Casey said he could do is because of free will. And
Yeah.
that's the bottom line in past life work. It's free will. And you can change your mind at any given point in time and then go off on a whole different trajectory. And that's what happened with him.
Now, speaking of free will and choice, so as you said in your post on Facebook, he's now with his Eddie Keiki. Now, as far as I understand for the readings, Casey's supposed to reincarnate in, I can't remember the date. Do you think maybe TJ might be over the other side talking to Eddie right now and saying, hey, what's the deal? What do we think we all hook up together the next lifetime?
Yeah, maybe try to all come in at the same time. That would be helpful, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that there's talk about. I just saw something today on Facebook on the one of the Edgar Casey Facebook groups talking about him coming back in 2158 or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I knew it was like a fair
Yeah,
bit away.
yeah, but I don't know that. I don't know, if he will or not. But TJ said he would come back. He said he had a lot more work to do. So
He
I'm
could get
sure.
all those people out of his house.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see about that.
Maybe he'll come back and he'll actually have his money problems sold out, and then he can just buy the house, and and be like some
Oh,
billionaire. They can just go out and buy his house, and he wouldn't have any issues with that. But yeah, it'd be so interesting to see if those two come back, and at the same lifetime, stuff like that, and see what happens. But according to, I was talking to John on on the podcast a while ago too. He's talking about 2038, and there's big changes happening with this timeline prophecy, and there's supposed to be 1,000 years of evil being kind of closed down. That's kind of, I'm kind of paraphrasing that. So it'd be a perfect time for them to come back and re-educate everybody. And it'd be a good time right now with all the craziness happening in the world right now. I think it'd be
we've lost so many. I personally have lost so many mentors, and I guess I'm getting at that point in life now where they're making a transition, and it's sad because there aren't that many Casey scholars left anymore, and I just don't ever want that material to be lost. I don't. I want that. I want that legacy of Casey to continue, and I wish more people would take the time to get to know who he was and all the tremendous good that he's done. Especially, like I said, with the health readings, we're just catching up. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book about physical karma. Karma can be a real pain. And I went and did a lot of research on the health readings that he did about why. And I do a session with people now about if they've got a chronic condition, did it originate in a previous lifetime? And if it did, does knowing about it release it in this life? So that was another research project that I did. But all that was because of Casey, because of the work that he had done in that area.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot there. TJ used to tell me he was going to live to 140, and I was not happy with him when he left when he was only 86. So anyway, I don't know how long he's going to hang out with his friends in the afterlife, but I hope most souls, it takes 50 to 200 years between lifetimes, depends on, and also they could come back sooner, depends on how they left, but that's another story. But for him, I think he knows he has a lot of work to do, but he's going to try to time it this time a little bit better.
Yeah, that was such a crazy at the beginning of your book, and you talked about the timing and where he was looking at Casey, how can I connect? And then all of a sudden, because like you say, there's no time on the other side, and he just kind of looked away, and then all of a sudden, Casey's older, and
Yeah.
and his wife there is older, and they've already had the kids, and it was like, oh, what do I do now? So
Yeah.
it's such a fascinating story. Well, I'm always been a big fan of I always call him Eddie Kiki. I'm going to use that for now. So he's probably on their side. He's probably looking at me, and he's just kind of just staring at me. I just because he's got that piercing look. Even if you look at his picture, I always think he's like he's just looking at me. It's just really, it's kind of weird sometimes. If I'm having a bad day or someone, I'll just look at his book and his picture will just kind of just look at you and he's got that look. And like he's just looking right through you, right? So,
Yeah.
but I'm always a big fan. He's been a big influence on me. I know I never had any spiritual mentors as a child or as a young man, so I fell into Casey's stuff very, very late in the ball game. But just reading over his work and then all the people associated with that too, as well, like yourself, John, everybody else that I've met through the area. I just think it's a fabulous thing. I really can't see it going anywhere. Like anything, it's just going to ebbs and flows. On a side note, I have, because I work in the weird world of the woo woo. That was a hard one to say. That I understand that a lot of people who are in the psychic areas now, that Casey's working with everybody on the other side anyway. He's working with so many people on the other side. It's just like he's continuing his work, but he's just on the other side now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is so fascinating from my understanding. But yeah, I just think his legacy will always live on. I think the story of that, it's an interesting story about, TJ. I kind of want to do the show about him. It's kind of an homage to him, an homage, I guess I should say. Pardon me, I'm
Yeah.
problem speaking there.
Well,
I think just it's nice to somebody to recognize this, but it's more than his past lives. And I, even though the whole thing was kind of to get you interested, but obviously Thomas Jefferson and Alexander the Great, of course, people are going to be tuning in. Who's that? What are you talking about? But it's more than a story. Like, it's just a story of, it's almost like a love story. It's almost like, I always think that love is the one thing that transcends space and time, and that the love for an individual or a group supersedes anything else that could ever happen in an individual's incarnation, his lifetime. This willingness to go through these lifetimes together and reincarnate after another, to be that, and just a matter of, I need to be with these people again.
Yeah.
Even it doesn't matter how short or how long, I just need to be with my family, my soul family. I just think that's such a cool and neat idea that we have, and we can do that.
Yeah, I think that the whole idea of a soul family is what's so fascinating, that we've been together with the same group of souls since the beginning of time, since creation, actually. And that's why I say there's no such thing as an old soul, because we were all created at the same time. I think that the term old soul comes from some people have opted to come back more often, and they've gained a lot more knowledge. So they come across as this great, seer. But basically, we're all the same. There's no such thing as an old soul or a young soul or a retired soul. I mean, we're all the same. So what was interesting about that is one time I had a medium who was doing a reading for me, and I didn't tell her anything about my connection to Casey at all. And she said to me, she said, Edgar Casey's coming through. And I go, really? And then she said, do you know what he's most proud of about you? And I said, me? What? She said that you're carrying on his teachings on inspirational writing, because that's the other part of the work that I do. I call it soul writing, but Casey called it inspirational writing. And that was actually my thesis for my master's degree. And I teach it now. And she said, he's really, really, really proud that you're doing that. And she said, do you know why you're so involved with Casey? And I said, no. She says, because you were his daughter in a life in Africa. And so I thought, I don't remember any lifetimes in Africa. So I called TJ and I said, hey, because I thought, if I'm part of that soul family, then I'm part of TJ's soul. We're all somehow, whether we're in the core of it or whether we're on the periphery,
Mm-hmm.
And so I said to him, hey, she said that I had been with him in Africa. I said, I don't remember a lifetime in Africa. And he said, Joanne, Egypt is in Africa. I didn't even put two and two together. So yeah, so our little soul family here has some humor to it.
That's from my understanding of people who I guess would connect with Casey, he has such a sense of humor. It's like a dry humor, but a sense of humor that way. So But yeah, it's so amazing. But Joanne, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk about TJ today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I'm always light up when I talk about him, and especially now that he's gone. So I appreciate this opportunity, Michael. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. So I really appreciate that. So that being said, Joanne, like I always like to promote my guests on there. Obviously, you can pick up the book. I picked it up on Amazon. So for those who want to pick it up, but if you want to connect with Joanne, how do they do that, Joanne?
My website is joannedimaggio.com, JoanneDimaggio.com. Yes, like the baseball player. And the different kinds of regressions that I offer, and the soul writing, and the books. And I've got a newsletter you can sign up for where I do a case study every month and a soul writing message. So if you're interested, you could sign up for that. And if you want a regression, you can book it right online. And I do them through Zoom. So I'm happy to work with anybody that's interested in exploring their past lives.
Ah, that's so amazing. And again, I've had a few people that reached out to me and had a session with you, and they really enjoyed it. So if you get a chance, get on the old interweb there and book yourself an appointment there. And but that being said, Joanne, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I know TJ and Eddie. Oh, wait, so I'm gonna be using that forever now.
Eddie Keiki.
Eddie Keiki. I'm sure they're looking down at you right now and they're smiling right now. So and again, everybody, I just want to say again, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. This has been the Metaphysical Mentor Podcast with Michael Philpott. Thank you so much for joining me, and goodbye for now.